always black and white. However, understanding the fundamentals of and the basic principles of learning theory can help you gain a better understanding of your horse and make training more ethical and more effective and more fun for both of you. I'm Anna, I'm a certified equine behaviour consultant, a holistic behavioural therapist, and positive reinforcement based trainer. So, when we're talking about horses learning and the training that we do with them, there are two main types of conditioning that we use when training horses. So, this is operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So, classical conditioning is learning through association. For example, if you always feed your horse in a certain place, they will begin to create positive associations with that place and associate it with the food. This type of conditioning can also work in the background of operant conditioning. For example, training with positive reinforcement can create positive associations with the trainer, the environment, the context, the equipment, and the activity taking place when the desired appetitive is being associated with whatever is going on at the time. The negative emotions that are associated with um, some forms of punishment can be then associated with the trainer, the context, the activity, the equipment, and things like that. So classical conditioning is different from operant because whereas operant is creating a voluntary response, classical conditioning involves creating an involuntary response through emotional association. A good example we can use of this is Pavlov's dogs. So Pavlov would ring a bell and give the dogs food. And eventually, obviously, ringing a bell and giving the dogs food would cause the dogs to salivate. And he always rang the bell before he gave the dogs food. And then when he rang the bell, they would begin to salivate because they associated the sound of the bell with getting the food. Even when he stopped giving them the food, they would continue to salivate until eventually that association then lost its value. And the bell no longer meant that they were going to get food, so they no longer had that response when it was no longer associated with that after a long period of repetitions of not having food after the bell. So you may have experienced classical conditioning if you have any emotional associations to music. So for example, if you listen to a certain song during a really happy period of your life and then you hear that song again, it takes you right back to the place. You feel all these positive emotions because it reminds you of everything that was going on at that time. Operant conditioning involves shaping of a voluntary behaviour. So for example, if you want to teach a horse to pick up their foot for hoof care, conditioning them to display that behaviour in response to a cue, and then they will be reinforced for that. So operant conditioning consists of four main quadrants that we can split it into to break things down. So we can break it into, if we have a grid here that has positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. And I want to start by saying in this context, punishment just means it's going to decrease the behaviour. Reinforcement just means it's going to see an increase in the behaviour. And negative in this context doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means like subtracting. Like in a scientific form, negative is just taking something away. And positive doesn't necessarily mean good in this context. It just means adding something. So instead of taking something away, it's the addition of something. So if we have positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, then where the four quadrants collide, we have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So that can seem like a lot of words and seem a bit complicated, so we're going to break it down and have some examples. So we're going to start here with positive reinforcement, which is, so as I said, positive is adding, and reinforcement means it's going to increase the behaviour. So positive reinforcement is the addition of an appetitive or something that the animal wants or finds reinforcing in order to increase a behaviour. The addition of an appetitive in order to increase behaviour. With positive reinforcement, we often pair it with a bridge signal or a marker, so you often see it used in clicker training, or sometimes in dog training people will use a specific word. With horses, we'll generally hear people using a clicker or a tongue click, like, or sometimes they will just be using positive reinforcement without using a bridge signal, but the bridge signal is a marker and captures a moment in time which tells the horse they've done the right thing, and that what they have done is going to be reinforced and they're going to receive a reward. This is really handy for capturing moments in time, so you can get it really specific without having to wait for the animal to actually have the reward. It's great for further away distance behaviour. The primary reinforcer that we're probably going to be using in this context is food reward. We could also look at using scratches. The important thing is here that it's the addition of something in order to increase the behaviour. So, for example, you might want to go to work more if you get paid well for going to work. So the positive reinforcement is being paid to go to work. So you're receiving an appetitive, you're receiving something you want, you're receiving the money, um, which reinforces the behavior of your job. So then you're more likely to see an increase in you doing your job if you're being paid for it. Obviously, then there's other factors that come into that, which we're going to get into with the more nuanced stuff. But the basics are, for example, if you unload the dishwasher and someone gives you a chocolate cake, you're more likely to want to unload the dishwasher again because you've had that positive reinforcement, that addition of something that you want. So an example in horse training would be a horse gaining a click followed by a food reward for touching a target. Behaviour of them touching a target with their nose has been marked with a bridge signal, and then they've been given a food reward, which is positively reinforcing that behaviour. It engages the seeking, care and play systems. Now these are 3 of the 7 core emotional systems shared by all mammals, which were identified by Dr. Panksepp. Benefits of using positive reinforcement in our training can include that it can, when done correctly and in the right context, create cooperative and happy animals. It can improve the horse-human relationship, and it can cause horses to have better reactions to novel stimuli, and also causes an increase in dopamine. Dopamine being released in training causes an increase in memory, learning, attention, and also in sleep. And obviously, in sleep, that's where we're retaining and processing a lot of information. So there are disadvantages potentially to using positive reinforcement in our training, especially if it's done incorrectly or not implemented with the right timing, or exactly how would be the most beneficial in that situation. Disadvantages obviously include that if it's used incorrectly or we reinforce the wrong behaviours, it can cause some frustration, and it can also cause an increase in undesirable behaviours if we're accidentally reinforcing the undesirable behaviours, or if the other quadrants are at play and that's causing some more unwanted emotional systems to come into play, which we'll get into later, because positive reinforcement can work in conjunction with negative punishment. Negative reinforcement is the next context we're going to look at, which is the removal, so negative removal, and reinforcement means it's going to increase the behaviour. So it's the removal of an aversive or something the animal doesn't like in order to increase the behaviour. Sometimes in horse training we hear this being called pressure and release. For example, with a horse, you could take your legs off the horse when they move forward. So negative reinforcement would be you want the horse to move forwards. So when they move forward, you stop squeezing with your legs. You're removing that pressure of your legs. So the removal of something they don't like is reinforcing the behaviour of moving forwards. So the next time they feel that pressure of the legs, they are more likely to move forwards, to get the negative reinforcement of that pressure being removed. Because in this quadrant of training there is a correct answer, so to speak, which causes a release of pressure, this type of reinforcement can engage the seeking system. And it also works in conjunction with positive punishment, so can have the same drawbacks of positive punishment, because if we're using negative reinforcement or pressure release training, you're probably having to apply an aversive in the first place in order to be able to release it to use that negative reinforcement. Advantages include that if switching to positive reinforcement isn't an option or isn't right for that situation, it can create desired behaviour and avoid the stress of traditional or escalating sort of methods. And, it can also be a great way to shape and train behaviours when used correctly, and we don't necessarily need to use escalation. The next quadrant we're going to look at now is positive punishment. So this is adding something in order to decrease a behaviour, which means we're going to be adding something that the animal doesn't want. A horse example would be using a whip or the addition of a whip to decrease a behaviour, such as refusing a fence. A human example would be adding extra homework, giving the kids something they don't want in order to decrease the behaviour of playing up in class. The addition of an aversive stimulus can activate the fear system, and it can also cause some suppression of the seeking, play, and care systems. Suppression of these systems can cause the animal to become depressed or shut down, or in some cases, if it's repetitive punishment and there is no right answer, we can see an animal go into what's called learned helplessness. These horses sometimes are labelled as a schoolmaster or bomb-proof, and they can be seen to be, oh, they're really chill and relaxed, but in some cases they can actually be shut down and experiencing the effect of an overuse of positive punishment. Some of the undesirable consequences of using positive punishment specifically, obviously because it doesn't tell the animal what we do want, it just suppresses a symptom. So it can have undesirable consequences such as creating fear, sometimes aggression if the horse's warning signals are being suppressed or the horse feels threatened and that's their only option, they don't feel like they have a flight option. It can also cause some damage to the horse-human relationship. So coming back to that classical conditioning, obviously then there's going to be negative associations created with the training, the situation, the context and the trainer and any equipment and anything like that. A time where we can utilise positive punishment is in a situation where we're doing some damage control, like trying to stop a situation that's an emergency from escalating and from causing any damage. With good training, we can work to avoid these situations from occurring altogether. So, it comes down to setting up for success and reinforcing what we do want to see instead of having to suppress the behaviours that we don't want to see. We're going to look at now negative punishment, so removing something in order to decrease a behaviour. So this would be taking away something that the animal wants or finds repetitive in order to decrease a certain behaviour that they were doing when that punishment was applied. The removal of an appetitive in order to decrease behaviour. For example, taking a horse's food away if they're pinning their ears. This can cause a lot of frustration and undesirable consequences, often the same consequences as we see with positive punishment, but there is also a risk of activating the rage system and causing a lot of frustration and even some extinction bursts if their reinforcement has been taken away. If you have any questions or you'd be interested in training or behavioural consultations or behavioural therapy, please do get in touch. I have availability for clients online and in person. You can contact me through email, Instagram or Facebook. If you have any ideas for things you'd like to see for future videos, then be sure to get in touch and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Enjoy your training with your horses.